Hey everybody, Johnny here. This is a follow-up to the previous video we did, where we created a torus knot generator. In this video, we'll add another node, which will take a cyclic curve and turn it into a Mobius strip. So let's say I have this curve here. Right now, there are no twists along this curve, but when I add my Mobius node to it, it now has a half turn added into the profile. Which means if I start on the top of this side and continue along this face, when I go all the way around the object, staying on that face, I'll actually end up on the bottom of this same side. And then if I do it again, I'll end up back on the top. So this wide flat part is actually one continuous surface, comprised of both sides of any given point on this strip. Now right offhand, this might seem like a trivial thing to do. Let's look at an easy for instance. I'll add a node tree to this object, add a curved circle, do a curve to mesh, and then use a quadrilateral as its profile curve. I'll shrink this down, and then I'll add a set shade smooth node and set it so that it's not shaded smooth. Now, if I wanted to add a twist to this curve, I could simply change the tilt along my initial curve. To do that, I'll use a set curve tilt node, and I'll set the tilt using the spline parameter node. I'll plug in the factor to the tilt. So at the beginning point of this circle, the tilt will be 0, and then all the way around it will be 1. We know that a full rotation is actually 2 pi. So we'll need to multiply the factor by 2 pi to make this rotate all the way around. I'll type in tau as my shortcut for 2 pi. So when we do this, you can see that there's actually a little bit of a glitch here where the two ends meet. And while this isn't terrible, it isn't perfect. And then, if we were to say only want this to do half a turn, and so we would only twist it times pi, now we start running into some big problems. Mainly because it doesn't know how to hook up the end of the previous loop with the beginning of the next one. Because of this, we're going to need to have a bit more complicated way of getting rid of this section and always connecting it up nicely. What we're going to need to do is delete these faces out of here, and then find a way to connect these points to these points in their proper orientation, no matter how many twists we've done, and no matter how many points happen to be along our profile curve. Because let's say our profile curve was a curved circle with 5 sides. If we do a full rotation, again, it's pretty good. But if we only wanted to do a fifth of a rotation, which would be tau divided by 5, well, we start running into these problems. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take our original cyclic curve, turn it into a mesh, and then delete this edge, therefore opening up this last edge. The first thing we'll want to do is mark our start and our endpoints so that we can use them later. To do that, I'll use a store named attribute node and set it to Boolean. I'll name this one start point. I'll add in a curve endpoint selection node, plug that into the value, have the start size be 1 and the end size be 0. So now if I stick a viewer node on this stored name attribute node by Control-Shift clicking on it, and then Control-Shift clicking on my endpoint selection, you'll see that I've selected this point. Now we'll do the same thing for the endpoint. We'll copy these over, change this to endpoint, and only select the endpoint. Now if I Control-Shift click on these two, you'll see that it's this next point down here that's been selected. Now that I have these, I'm going to go ahead and set my curve tilt. So again, I'll use a set curve tilt node, add in a spline parameter node and plug it into the tilt. I'll add a math node and multiply this by tau So this is going to be my number of full rotations. And then I'm going to want to have a control number so I can say how many full rotations I want. So I'll multiply this again, put a default value of 1 here, and plug this in to my input. So we can see what's happening. I'll add a curve to mesh node, and then I'll add a curved primitive circle set to a resolution of 4, plugged into the profile curve. I'll shrink this down and add in a mesh set shade smooth. So now we're back to this. If I adjust my value here, you'll see I run into the same problems I had before, right here. If I were to enter half a turn, that isn't going to look good. Let's go ahead and delete these faces here. Let's go ahead and add some frames so we can keep track of what we're doing. Here, I'm setting some attributes. So I'll select these, hit Ctrl J, select the frame, and hit F2 to rename it. And I'll rename this one Set Main Attributes. Here, I'm setting the tilt. Here, I'm solidifying my curve. So now I want to delete this last face loop. I'll add a delete geometry node and set the type to face. Now, which faces do we want to actually delete? We want to have an attribute with all of those faces marked. So let's come back over here and store another named attribute. We'll call this one end loop. And it's going to contain both the last and the first points. So now if I do a named attribute input node, set it to Boolean, and set it to my end loop, I'll delete that selection. So now we've gotten rid of those twisted faces in there. We'll go ahead and name this delete last face loop. So now we need to extrude these endpoints and move them over here to these start points. We'll use an extrude mesh node to do that. We'll put it in edge mode. We'll put it in edge mode. We'll bring the scale way down. And we only want to select these last vertices. Well, we had a named attribute called endpoint. So let's use that. And we'll use that as our selection. It really doesn't matter what your offset scale is here because we're going to move these points in a moment. But you can see we've only extruded the last points that we needed. Now, our endpoints have changed. Currently, the endpoint attribute is still pointing to these 4 points that we extruded. But now they should be these 4 points, the new ones. So we'll use a store named attribute node, choose our endpoints, change the type to Boolean, and we'll connect the top output of our extrude to the value. So now if I Control-Shift-Click on this named attribute node and on my endpoint input node, you'll see that it's these outside points that are now selected. Now this next part is where it gets a little tricky. We're going to want to set a new position for each one of these points. So we'll use a geometry set position node. Then we need to determine which points we're going to set. We need to set these new endpoints that we just created. So I'll use an input named attribute node, choose endpoint, and connect it to selection. If I just mess with the offset, you can see that I've selected the correct vertices. The question is, how do we connect these points to these points? And when we start adding partial twists, how do we make sure they line up with the correct side? First, it'll be helpful if we give a number to each point of our profile curve. What I mean by that is for every instance of our profile curve, the points around it will have an index. So arbitrarily, this one might be 0, this one might be 1, 2, and 3. And then all the way up the curve, this one will be 0. This one will be 1. This one will be 2. And the one in the underneath would be 3, all the way around. If there were no twists, 0 would connect with 0, 1 would connect with 1, and so on. So how can we store that? Let's go back to where the profile is actually created. Right here with our solidify curve. When we solidify a curve like this, any attributes that are on the profile curve get replicated on every profile curve that's created. So if I store a named attribute on my profile curve, it will get distributed across my new mesh, just like I want here. So I'll store a named attribute, and I'll call this one profile index. I want it to be an integer, and the value I want to store is the current index on my profile curve. So we see the profile index is being set here, but we can do a little experiment just to verify it's working the way we want. I'll add an input named attribute node and choose profile index. Then I'll say when this is equal to 0, now I'll Control-Shift-Click on my curve to mesh and Control-Shift-Click on this equals. So we can see that that one edge has been selected all the way around. And if I change this value, that also moves around. So this is doing exactly what we want. But how do we get just these 4 points? Well, one way to recreate just part of a geometry is to use the duplicate elements node just to duplicate the parts you need. So if I take this geometry and then add a duplicate elements node with the type set to point and the amount set to 1, I want to duplicate my start points. So if I shift-click on my duplicate elements node here for a preview, you'll see I'm just left with my original 4 points. So let's grab their positions and put them into this set position node. So I'll choose a sample index node, and I'm going to sample those 4 points that I just created. I'm sampling a vector because I want their position. So I'll choose an input position node, and I'll plug this into the position of the set position. Right now, all 4 points go to point 0 because I'm sampling point 0. But the question is, what do I actually want to sample here? If we look in the spreadsheet, we see that my endpoints have indices of 160 through 163. Well, that's not going to help us out much. But we can see that their profile index are 0, 1, 2, and 3. So if the index that I sample here is using the profile index, I can choose the correct indices from here. So I'll duplicate this and choose profile index and use that as my sample index. But that's only going to work if they line up. Like when I have a twist value of 0. Because in this case, 0 lines up with 0, 1 with 1, etc. If I were to do 1 full turn, it still works. 2, 3. But what about when we want to do something like a half turn? In the case of a half turn, if our profile curve has 4 sides, then that means that these are misaligned by 2 faces. So if I were to add 2 to this profile index value, you'd see that one of the faces is correct, but the others are not. That's because the profile index, instead of going from 0 to 3, now goes from 2 to 5. And that's not going to work. But if we duplicate this node and change it to modulo, and set the modulo value to the number of faces of our profile, in this case 4, all of a sudden, this lines up perfectly. Because the modulo is always going to give us the remainder of this new number and 4, so it'll always be a value of 0, 1, 2, or 3 in this case. We don't want to have to change this number every time we change our profile, but we don't have to, because we have a way of knowing how many edges our profile curve has. If we take our profile curve and add a domain size node, we can set the type to curve, and we can pull out the point count. Now, if we were to increase this to say something like 6, and we had a half turn like we do, well, half turn would be 3 faces off. So if we change this offset to 3, this works nicely. But again, we don't want to have to put this number in every time. But if we multiply this point count by the number of turns, so in this case we have 6 times 0.5, we get 3. And that's our offset. So now if we change the resolution of this curved circle to say something like 10, we're automatically getting the correct offset. Let's make a couple of adjustments here real quickly. I'm going to name this node into Mobius. And my initial curve, I'm going to pull in from my group input. And also, I'm going to pull in my profile curve from my group input. Now if I delete this node, add a new node tree, and then add a group Mobius node, I can go ahead and add my curve and my profile curve again. I'll jump back into my Mobius node and clean up the input names. We have our main curve, the turns, and my profile curve. Now right now, I have my profile curve with 5 edges. So if I do a half turn, you'll see that this doesn't line up correctly. But that makes sense, as a half turn would be 2.5 sides around. And so you can't have an even connection with 5 sides divided by 2. However, you could put in turns in terms of fifths. So you could say 2 divided by 5 would be 2 edges. And so now this one turns and connects 2 faces away, or 0.6, or 0.8, or 1.4, whatever you wanted to put in there. Now you may have noticed that this last section is kind of off, just a hair. Like the rotation of our last curve and our first curve are the same. Well, that's because it is. If you remember correctly, the rotation at our first index was 0, and the rotation at our last was tau. So 0 and tau are actually the same spot on the circle. So this should actually be a little less than tau. But how much less? Assuming that our resolution is even all the way around, if we divide tau by our resolution and subtract that from tau, we'll get what it should be 1 step earlier. So let's jump into the Mobius node, and if we take the domain size of our main curve, we have our point count. So if we do math, and we do tau divided by the point count, and then a math subtract, subtracting that value from tau, and then use this as the top value of our rotation, you'll see it cleans up perfectly. And now it's hard to tell exactly where it begins and where it ends. So as you work with this Mobius node, make sure your number of turns is related to the resolution of your curve circle. That is to say, if your resolution is 4, your turns should be some multiple of 0.25. Let's replace our curve circle with a quadrilateral. And make it wider than it is tall. Now, even though this has 4 sides, if I only do a quarter turn, you'll see I run into problems because now my tall side is lined up with my wide side. So, really, the only valid twists for this are going to be multiples of 0.5, where whole values give whole turns, but values ending in 0.5 give half turns. Those partial turns are going to be what give your Mobius strip its properties. So finally, let's bring back in our torus knot node and replace our main curve with it. I'm going to add back in my group input and connect up my variables. Now they're all exposed here. So here's my 1-1 knot with no turns and with a half turn. And so now any of these knots that I generate, if the turns is 0.5, they'll be Mobius torus knots. And so there you have it, a Mobius torus knot. I hope you made it through the whole video, and I hope you're able to implement it on your own. However, if you would like access to the project files, they are available on my Patreon. There'll be a link in the description. Speaking of my Patreon, I want to give a shout out to all my Patreon supporters. You're all amazing, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope it inspires you to make something awesome. So until next time, I'll catch you later.